Hora de treinar o nosso listening em inglês. Fala pessoal, Ingrid aqui. Nesse vídeo eu vou dar continuidade à nossa série de vídeos em inglês do livro Pride and Prejudice, Orgulho e Preconceito. Esse vídeo é o vídeo do terceiro capítulo desse livro aqui. Então se você ainda não assistiu os vídeos do capítulo 1 e 2, vem aqui nesses vídeos dos cards e assiste, para você saber o que está acontecendo com a família Bennet. Esses vídeos em inglês do livro Pride and Prejudice estão muito simples, estão fáceis de entender. Eu não estou falando rápido, a linguagem é uma linguagem simples que reflete numa fala minha, numa narração fácil de entender. Então, até você que é básico no inglês consegue sim entender se forçar um pouquinho a prestar atenção direitinho. Esse e muitos outros vídeos estão aqui para poder te ajudar no inglês. Então, se inscreve no canal caso você ainda não é inscrito para não perder nenhum vídeo. Ativa também esse sininho maravilhoso para você ser notificado quando um vídeo novo chegar. Então, tá pronto? Aperta o cinto aí, abre teus ouvidos, já deixa tua curtida no vídeo, porque nós vamos embarcar no listening em inglês. This chapter is The Bennets Have a Visitor. I don't know if you remember, but we had a situation where Jane was well. She was sick and she was at Netfield Hall, but she got better and she returned home with her family. So Jane returned home this day. In the next day, in the following day, at breakfast, Mr. Bennet said to Mrs. Bennet that they were expecting a visitor. And Mr. Bennet said it was a gentleman. Mrs. Bennet wanted to know who. She thought it was Mr. Bingley, but it wasn't Mr. Bingley, it was Mr. Collins. Mr. Bennet said the visitor they were expecting was Mr. Collins. Mr. Bennet had this cousin called Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins is the one who is going to receive, inherit Longbourn House, where the Bennet family lives, when Mr. Bennet passed for another life. When Mr. Bennet dies, Mr. Collins is the one who is going to inherit the house. Mr. Bennet explained that 1 month ago, Mr. Collins sent him a letter, a huge letter. After this letter, or after this letter, you choose the pronunciation. After this letter, Mr. Bennet invited Mr. Collins to stay a while, spend some days with them, with the Bennet family in their house. For sure, Mrs. Bennet doesn't like Mr. Collins because the house wasn't going to belong to her daughters, but to this cousin, Mr. Collins. And something important to know about Mr. Collins is that he was a fat man. He was only 25, but he looked so much older. Mr. Bennet thought he was a foolish man, and he was like a pastor, a clergyman. Mr. Collins arrived at 4 o'clock on that day. He said how adorable the house was, how adorable the furniture was. What is furniture? Furniture is the couch, the desk, the chairs, the cupboard. These things are furniture. And he also said how beautiful the Bennet's daughter were. Mr. Collins said how great and good everything were, but he also said how much Lady Catherine de Bourgh was good. Who is this woman? Lady Catherine de Bourgh is a rich woman. Mr. Collins says Lady Catherine behaves as every lady should behave, because she has good manners, she is proud, but she's kind, she's helpful. You know, he said a lot of good things about Lady Catherine. He also said Lady Catherine gave him, Mr. Collins, a house to live. And to finish about Lady Catherine at this moment, he also said she told him he had to get married. So that's the reason that Mr. Collins came to Longbourn House, came to where the Bennet family lives, because he wanted to marry one of the Mr. Bennet's daughter. And who did he choose to get married to? He chose Miss Jane, the oldest daughter. But when he said he talked to Mrs. Bennet, it's a lot of names, so I'm a little bit confused sometimes. But when Mr. Collins talked to Mrs. Bennet, saying that he wanted to get married to Jane, Mrs. Bennet said that pretty soon Jane was going to be engaged. I love this pronunciation, engaged. And she gave Mr. Collins another option, Elizabeth Bennet, the second oldest daughter. So he had no choice. He chose Lizzie to get married to. In the following day, it was the second day that Mr. Collins was in the house. Everywhere, every place that Mr. Bennet went, Mr. Collins went too. And Mr. Bennet was tired, he was sick of it. So when he discovered that the ladies, his daughters, was going to Meryton, he asked Lizzie to take Mr. Collins with them. They are going to Meryton, so please take Mr. Collins with you, because Mr. Bennet wanted to be alone for a while. The girls and Mr. Collins arrived in Meryton. Remember Meryton? Meryton is a city very near where Mr. Bennet and his family lives. Meryton is also the city where the militia is for a while and where the girls' aunt lives. Mrs. Phillips. They arrived at Meryton, and Lydie and Kittia were very delighted to talk to Mr. Denny. Mr. Dennett introduced Mr. Wickham. We all know Mr. Wickham from the movie, bad guy. According to the book, Mr. Wickham is a very handsome man. So everybody was talking to each other. The Bennet girls, Mr. Collins, Mr. Denny, and Mr. Wickham. All of them were talking when they heard some horses coming. The gentlemen who were in these horses were Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy. Mr. Bingley, because he's so kind and good-natured, talked to everybody. Then he started talking just to Jane. While Bingley was talking to everybody, Lizzie was staring at Mr. Darcy. And she was very surprised when she noticed that Mr. Darcy was staring at Mr. Wickham and Mr. Wickham was staring at Mr. Darcy. So she thought that was a little bit weird. Darcy's face was very angry while Wickham's face was very red. When Darcy and Bingley rode away, when they left, the Bennet girls and Mr. Collins said bye-bye to the soldiers and they went to Aunt Philip's house. Their aunt said that the next day in the evening she was going to have dinner with some officers, and she asked her nieces to spend some time with the soldiers. And here we discovered that Lydia was interested in Mr. Wickham because her aunt, Mrs. Phillips, promised that Mr. Wickham would be invited. The next day came, and before dinner time, the girls went again to Meryton. When they arrived there, they were expecting to see Mr. Wickham. When he arrived, when he came, he talked to everybody, he greeted everybody, he smiled at everybody, but he sat near Lizzie Bennet. After talking to each other for a while with everybody, Mr. Wickham started to talk to Lizzie about Mr. Darcy. He kinda asked, but said for sure that Bingley and Darcy were at Netherfield Hall. Wickham wanted to know everything he could about Darcy. He asked how long he was in Netherfield Hall, how far away Netherfield Hall was from Meryton. Everything he could know, he wanted to know. Wickham also asked if Lizzie knew Darcy. She said, yes, I know. She said she had to stay 4 days with him and the other guys, his friends, at the same house. But the terrible thing starts now. Mr. Wickham, I'm going to stop to say Mr., okay? It's a lot of things to say. Wickham started saying to Lizzie how terrible Darcy was. He had to admit that everybody where Darcy lives loves him. Everybody usually loves Darcy because he's a polite man. He may be proud, but he is from a noble family, he is rich, so because of that, everybody loves Darcy. But Lizzie wanted to know why they had that feeling to each other, you know. Remember when Darcy saw Wickham, Darcy had an angry face, and when Wickham saw Darcy, he had a red face. He was scared. Wickham was scared when he saw Darcy, and Lizzie wanted to know why. So here Wickham said this version of what happened. He said that Mr. Darcy, the old Mr. Darcy, Mr. Darcy's father, was a very good man to him. The old Mr. Darcy even promised Wickham a place to live. Wickham wanted to be a clergyman. He wanted to be a man from the church. But when the old Mr. Darcy died, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy ignored what his father decided. According to Wickham, Mr. Darcy, now Fitzwilliam Darcy, refused to do what his father wanted. He ended this conversation saying that Darcy didn't help him, and his sister, Georgiana Darcy, was as proud as his brother is. At this time, Lizzie was a soft-touch person. Just a little. What is soft touch? Soft touch is someone who can be easily persuaded, and she believed in everything Wickham said to her about Darcy. When they were returning home, Lizzie was thinking about what Wickham said, and when they arrived at home, when she was alone with Jane, she said to her sister, everything Wickham said to her about Darcy. Remember that Jane is a good person, she's kind, she's good-natured, she can't see bad things in anyone. So she just couldn't believe in what Wickham said. She couldn't believe that Darcy was so bad, she couldn't believe in Mr. Wickham's story. However, Lizzie replied her sister saying that Lizzie herself heard Darcy saying about him he was a proud man. A few days later, Mr. Bingley invited the Bennet family for the ball he was organizing. For sure, everybody was very happy for that. In the following days, the girls had to stay at home. They were hunked down at home because it started to rain very heavily. So they couldn't leave. And this is how this chapter ends. E aí, o quanto você conseguiu entender desse capítulo? Se você ficou um pouco perdido aí, se não conseguiu entender tudo, isso mostra pra mim que você tem que melhorar o seu listening. E uma forma de você fazer isso é com um curso gratuito que eu disponibilizo para vocês. Esse curso gratuito tem 30 aulas. Cada aula você vai receber o PDF da aula, vai receber o material da aula, além de receber também MP3 das aulas. Então você não vai apenas assistir, você vai ter esse curso para você com o material, com o MP3. Para você acessar esse curso e aproveitar essas aulas durante a quarentena, vai lá na descrição do vídeo que eu deixei o acesso para ele lá. O método do curso envolve neurociência e chunks, para fazer com que você aprenda de uma forma mais rápida. O que são chunks? Chunks são estruturas no inglês que fazem com que você aprenda mais rápido. Então esse curso vai muito te ajudar no teu listening, grammar, vocabulary e tantas outras coisas no inglês. Então aproveite para você melhorar o seu inglês durante esse tempo com esse curso gratuito. Novamente, o acesso para ele está lá na descrição do vídeo. Vai lá e garanta o teu acesso. Se você gostou do listening, deixa aí a tua curtida no vídeo, compartilha com seus amigos, and we see each other when next video. Bye bye!